Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Flo. I'm one of the conveners and facilitators, part of the Secretariat of the African Food Systems Transformation Collective. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give it a few more minutes, 2 or 3 maybe, to allow further participants to join. Today's webinar is going to be focusing on territorial approaches, and we've got 4 issue briefs that we are launching with today's webinar that all speak in different ways to territorial approaches. Today, I'll be taking a little bit of a backseat and perhaps dropping in the occasional prompt and question, but the majority of the facilitation is going to be managed by my colleague Malik. Malik, would you like to say a few opening words, remarks, as we wait for others to join us?
Sure, thanks, Flo. Look, I just want to confirm, can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you clearly, yes.
Fantastic, okay. Great, well, hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. While we filter in, let me just give a quick word of thanks to the background team, specifically Lucas, who's helped us put this together, Florian, who's done all the legwork in the program development and work with our highly valued advisory committee and writing team. Our advisory committee themselves, who I will introduce you to in the course of this webinar, and then the issue brief leads who've taken up the task of developing the 4 issue briefs we're talking about today. So just to give a quick word of introduction to myself and the AFSTC, as well as the African Climate Foundation. My name is Malik Dasu. I'm a senior program officer at the African Climate Foundation, focusing on our sustainable land use and agriculture portfolio, specifically our food systems work. The AFSTC came out of a recognition that our approach to food systems investments as philanthropic groupings is just not enough. There isn't enough grant funding going into the space. But secondly, it's uncoordinated. And in Africa, it often means that approaches are siloed and don't often yield the results they should be. But instead of trying to rectify it ourselves, we sort of took a step back and recognized that there is a wealth of information at our disposal in experts who've been working on discrete thematic topics, but also cross-cutting issues for decades. And we wanted to really figure out how we leverage that information to advise philanthropic investments into African food systems. And so that was the birth of this collective, at least for this project cycle, I should say. This is just the first very active year of the collective, and how it may evolve is still to be seen, but will be clarified as we approach our final webinars. So with that, I see we're on 52 participants. I think, yes, please just introduce yourselves in the group if you can. Who you are, which organization you're representing, and maybe where you're based. And then we can kick off. So today we have the pleasure of talking about the territorial perspective to food system transformation, understanding how we approach food systems transformation in a more holistic, but also locally relevant and way, with global megatrends like climate change and macroeconomic structures all influencing how markets in Africa are being shaped. It's really important for us to take that sort of broader vision of how we transform our foodscapes. So first to speak on this, about the agroecological territories and integrated landscape approaches to advancing food systems transitions in Africa, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Stephen Greenberg. Stephen, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Malik. Thanks for the opportunity to present over here. I'll try and be as quick as I can. 10 minutes, not a long time. I was asked just before we have the discussion about the about the policy briefing to just talk quickly to what territories are. And I think just very schematically to make a distinction between landscapes, which would be kind of the physical areas defined by natural features, ecosystems, which would be the interactions between living entities and that landscape, and territories, which can be considered to be the kind of the human organization in a landscape. Maybe we can have further discussion about that as we move along. I just wanted to make a couple of introductory remarks before we move into it. I mean, I think that the obvious context is the polycrisis that we're all facing. When we look at the climate change and the environmental situation, we can see that Africa has been the least responsible for causing these, but in part is one of the most vulnerable to these crises that are emerging. Climate, Africa is responsible for 3% or less of emissions globally, but is being made to bear the burden of the impacts of climate change disproportionately. We're also facing very serious political situation now globally, probably the rise of a return to colonization by force, no more playing games with human rights and a liberal democracy, and rather just going in straight. So I think that Africa can expect to be facing a new wave of colonization, direct force colonization, in order to extract the natural resources of the continent. We can expect a depopulation agenda in which the people are obliterated as they are being obliterated in Gaza as a test case. I think we're facing a very serious situation. We need African unity, but obviously we don't have that currently. We've got corporate or elites which are prepared to sell out the continent and the people for their own interests. And we have a situation where divide and rule tactics by the imperialists are being very effective. So if we look at DRC, for example, and the United States coming in there and supposedly ending the war, but actually there's nothing about recounting what had happened, justice for victims of that war, or anything. It's just business as usual now. We're going to move on from here and take the resources and use them as we wish. This is a very serious context. So we can look at the natural resources in Africa already undergoing degradation over some period. We can look at the Green Revolution model from an agriculture point of view, which has been doing damage for quite some time now in Africa. Clear felling of forests for monocultures, soil and water pollution and degradation as a result of synthetic fertilizer overuse, as a result of indiscriminate pesticide use. And it's likely that this model will continue and intensify under the imperialist thrust, to great damage to the people and the natural systems of Africa. There's a need for integrated approaches in confronting this, both to reduce damage and to restore natural systems. And we're looking for wise stewardship of natural resources in the interests of the continent and its people first. I think this is something highly critical. The impact of agricultural practices is not limited to within farm boundaries. So whatever practices we do on the farms has an impact beyond the farm. So pesticide use doesn't just stop at the farm boundaries, but actually it pollutes water outside of the farm as well. Likewise, the way that we manage the wider natural resources, alien invasive species, the way that riparian systems are looked after has an impact on the quality of natural resources on farm. So these things go hand in hand. You can't separate them out. And so one of the key things here when we're talking about an integrated landscape approach is to talk about how do you integrate the production system into the wider system of biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. We've based this briefing on a concept of concept of agroecological territories, which comes from Wessel. This talks about 3 dimensions. One is adaptation of agricultural practices towards agroecology. The second one is conservation of biodiversity and natural resources. And the third one is embedded food systems. So that's bringing or reconnecting local populations with their food systems. and integrating food into the wider environment, as I was talking about, and then thinking about territorial markets, which is mostly a kind of a local first model. First, meet the needs of the locality and then expand outwards from there. Okay, some of the key findings were that there are practices of agroecology and agroforestry on the continent, diversified and mixed farming, using natural methods for soil fertility, pest management, and microclimate control. Integrated landscape approaches are functional on the continent. There are some large-scale projects, for example, the Great Green Wall Initiative, and there's also some smaller and more localized initiatives. So in 2014, NEPAD indicated 97 integrated landscape projects in 33 countries. Obviously, this doesn't cover everything, and obviously that's quite old statistics. Territorial markets also, there is work here being done. For example, participatory guarantee systems is operating in 22 countries on the continent at the moment. These are about really connecting producers and consumers, and in fact, all interested parties in the food system at local levels of quality assurance and connecting producers and consumers much more. Multi-actor governance systems also in operation in a number of areas, a very important approach about bringing all the different interests together to put on the table what are their interests, to try and work out how do you overcome conflicting interests, and to try and find common ground where people can work together at a landscape level to integrate food systems, agroecology and production systems, and your wider biodiversity and natural resource management. Okay, adoption of these approaches has indicated improved sustainability overall across a number of indicators. Time is very short, so I'm not going to go through all that right now, but there is some evidence of benefit both environmentally and socially and in terms of food security. I won't mention multi-stakeholder platforms again. Key obstacles to transition include serious conflicts of interest at a local level, especially where there's strong power imbalances, and we're going to have to work out mechanisms in which this can be overcome. How do you deal with very strong actors who are not willing to share power? Knowledge and skills. So on agroecology and its production, I mean, of course, some of these practices are long-standing in Africa, but there's also other knowledge that can be brought into this, as well as skills around facilitation, process facilitation, and conflict resolution. These are very important skills in multi-actor processes. Lack of financial and material resources, it's a usual story. Long-term processes with uncertain outcomes. So we need resources that are going to be able to support these deeper processes that take a long time, where you don't necessarily know exactly what the result is going to be. It's a kind of an emergent result. These things are not being resourced adequately yet. So you end up having project funding, but you're not really getting programmatic funding that is longer term. Institutional and policy support, the policy frame tends towards supporting conventional production still, and monoculture, individualization of production and consumption, and separation of production from the wider environment. So these are some challenges from an institutional and policy point of view. And then obviously the environmental challenges that are facing everybody now. You can be an agroecology farmer, but if there's no water, you're not going to produce. So these things will hit all farmers, and we can't therefore say that agroecology just in and of itself is a solution to everything. There are some deeper issues that we're going to have to deal with, although agroecology can be a direction in which we want to follow. And then just finally, the key recommendations for philanthropy. First of all, addressing food system drivers of environmental degradation rather than isolated individual projects on poverty reduction or whatever, because those are not really responding to systemic issues. Secondly, support for transitions to and deepening of agroecological practices with an emphasis on landscape approaches, agroecosystem redesign, because often agroecology is thought about just as production practices on farm, but we need to start thinking in that broader view about how agroecology connects to wider landscapes and the management of wider landscapes. Participatory community-based natural resource management with transdisciplinary approaches. So this means setting up transdisciplinary and multi-actor teams to take on issues. investing in territorial market development, especially including multi-actor governance mechanisms. Then, of course, supportive policies at multiple levels, including national and subnational. And finally, ongoing capacity development, especially around agroecology and long-term multi-actor process facilitation skills. So that's my 10 minutes, and I will stop there.
That's on the dot, Stephen. Thank you so much, and a really concise overview of a very good issue brief. Thank you so much for that. Great, then moving swiftly along. Next, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Luke Metelerkamp, who will be presenting on urban food governance. Luke, over to you.
Thanks, Malik and Stephen. Afternoon, everyone. So I think to situate this, because the urban question is often missing, just come back from UNFSS +4, and there was a lot of discussion, I think, in those at the kind of UN level and many other spaces, similar spaces, where there is the kind of discussion very importantly on agroecological transitions, the kind of production questions, the modes of production, resources to access, and requirements for transition in that space, and some growing discussion on the linkages between the production side and urban spaces. But there's very little discussion taking place on the impacts of the connections the other way, from the city to the rural landscapes, and also the kind of specifically urban dimensions that are kind of beyond the questions of production. And I think that's a space that this brief was trying to, in a sense, fill in to some extent. And so we, as ECLI, kind of work with a network of 2,500 cities and local governments internationally, and are engaged in a number of programs across Africa currently, trying to establish and strengthen these linkages between and the capacities within local governments and the food system, with a big focus on many aspects that align with agroecology and kind of many of the points that Stephen has mentioned. So for this brief, we undertook a round of interviews with kind of African experts, as well as drawing on international specialists in places like Brazil, but also people who've been very involved in setting up food policy councils and movements in cities in the global north. So that's it, essentially what's informed the findings for this. So in terms of the levers of change that we flagged, or this group flagged, there was a real call for creating space for kind of more meaningful multi-stakeholder dialogue, both at city and kind of local government level. So thinking much more carefully about how local governments bring in the voices of civil society and other stakeholders into their kind of policy and food system management approaches, but also how the different levels of government get better at connecting with each other on issues relating to the food system. The call for that was particularly acute, I think, because generally local governments have a large mandate in terms of implementing food system actions, but they very often don't recognize the mandates they have. So when you speak into local governments, or you speak to people in local government, it very quickly, even in urban spaces, comes back to a question about how are we doing production? How are we growing food within cities? How are we kind of connecting into cold storage and value chain, without really thinking about how urban planning influences food system outcomes, how departments of health, departments of education, departments of transport, and many other facilities within kind of local government actually have quite a strong impact on the shape and form that the food system takes beyond a production question. So there is mandate. There is a lot of money actually being spent. In South Africa, we did a bit of a mapping, admittedly at national government level, which was saying roughly 9% of South Africa's GDP goes towards actions that serve to ensure the right to food is met. But there's very, very, very little coordinating structures in place to kind of think about how, to Stephen's point around working beyond projects and taking a more systemic intervention approach that addresses the root causes, there's very little overarching coordination and management that takes place across these functions. So our big push within this brief was also just to say that there's a lot being spent, And with a very small amount more, we could really improve the impact of this expenditure by firstly making it more visible, but also supporting the people that are undertaking these actions to connect with and understand and manage their work together in a more coherent and coordinated way. So in terms of the levers of change, I think we were saying there was a need to create more meaningful spaces for multi-stakeholder dialogue that worked with different departments within government, but also brought in civil society a lot more explicitly. And there were examples from spaces like Brazil, where this has been put into policy across all levels of government quite effectively. We felt that kind of this work in terms of building coalitions and kind of governance stakeholders through seed funding for concrete actions. So this idea of building coalitions through enabling them to undertake concrete actions together at local government level was something which many felt was a very effective methodology for driving and building this kind of local government coordination muscle. There was a need to be a lot more deliberately inclusive and focusing on the institutionalization of governance mechanisms. So there were a number of cases across Africa that we identified where there were multi-stakeholder platforms that were being set up. There were short efforts that had been made to fund city food desks, so kind of coordination desks within local governments to help coordinate across the departments. But very often these were project focused and champion driven. So I think there's a real need and an opportunity to kind of drive in to kind of supporting the institutionalization of those things that have been working. We also felt, and the kind of findings suggested, that there was a need to work on developing urban food strategies and action plans at city level. So supporting cities and local governments to kind of map what they're doing, understand their mandates, where they overlap, and building longer term plans for the food system that address many of the kind of systemic and kind of large challenges that those particular contexts are facing. There are a kind of small but growing number of these taking place. And I think the kind of one of our recommendations was strengthening out networks amongst that help to share the great examples of work that is taking place across the continent in this respect. And we identified a number of those. So I think for us, one of the kind of most important and first things we would want to do is putting additional resources into those who were already succeeding and creating kind of a lighthouses of success, and then providing a better peer-to-peer and exchange amongst local governments and cities working on those across the continent. So helping African cities and African city officials learn from and teach each other more effectively. I think we also felt that there was a need to kind of improve kind of support with kind of policy development and budget integration. We also looked at this idea of strengthening civil society voices and the need to kind of invest in that, and promoting and developing better public participation mechanisms. And we had a range of kind of recommendations and examples for how those could be done. And we also felt that there was a kind of real value to be taken from strengthening the kind of practitioner community around this, and supporting better South-to-South exchange, and recognizing that in much of the Global South, there actually has been a lot of work done on this and a lot of success been achieved, and thinking about how we, from an African perspective, both share the amazing work that is being championed by a number of cities and local governments across the continent, but also draw on the very, very valuable experiences that have been developed by others in Latin America and parts of Southeast Asia. I'm rushing through this, but Flo, I think my time is basically up. So I'll pause at that and then leave a bit of time for questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Luke. Yeah, I have to say this was one of my favorite issue briefs. It really met the mark. Maybe just to say one point for attendees to think about as the reflections happen, is that one of the brief that we gave for the development of these writings was that we need to understand what the theory of change is to transform our food systems. We need to understand what's already being done, why isn't it working and what do we need to try doing differently? And one example that Luke gave was that institutionalization of support for local government actors. So thank you for that, Luke. Florian, I'm going to hand over to you to guide us through the reflection session.
Thanks, Malik. Thanks, Luke, and thanks, Stephen, for your presentations, or your talks, rather. So the reflection by our panelists is really drawing on the expertise of people who straddle the research and the practitioner space, who have a background in various different topics related to the food system. And so we have an advisory committee of about 11 members at this stage who are playing that role. And we've asked them to listen to the talks that are being offered, to reflect on them, and to the extent that they've read the issue briefs themselves, also to comment on those very briefly. So the advisory committee member that we've asked to comment on this particular first round is Makore Mohochi, who is with the Kenyan Competition Authority. Did I get that right? I think that is
Yes, you're right.
Great. So Makore comes from a very strong economic background, but has a very deep interest in food systems and has participated very actively in the process of developing and reviewing the issue briefs, as well as the overview report, which we are currently finalizing. So Makore, please go ahead to offer some brief reflections on your impressions of these talks and issue briefs behind them.
Thank you, Florian, and a greeting to all of us. I believe I have 7 minutes for the 2 issue briefs.
Yes, 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So I'll start with the first issue brief, that is the agroecological territories and integrated landscape approaches to advancing food system transition in Africa, which was done by Dr. Stephen. So first of all, I want to commend the authors and the African Food Systems Transformation Collective team for this deeply grounded brief. Because when I look at the issue brief, it speaks directly to the ecological, social, and the political realities which we witness in our work across Africa at the moment, and a time when the continent faces compounding crisis, from land degradation to crisis stress. This issue brief offers a powerful case for a thinking food system through agroecological territories and integrated landscape governance. So when he was making a presentation, I looked at the key strengths and the contribution of this issue brief. And I'll mention a number of them, about 3 of them that I identified. That we have a systems-based lens on land, food, and ecology, whereby I can elaborate this one by saying that the brief succeeded in showing that agriculture cannot be separated from ecosystem health. That means that they are interlinked by defining agroecological territories across 3 domains, which came out clear in the presentation, whereby it looked at farming practice. There is a biodiversity aspect of it. There is also stewardship and the embedded food systems, which creates a clear holistic pathway for transition. Another key strength which identified with the issue brief is that there is the community-led landscape governance, whereby there is an emphasis on participatory governance, multi-actor platforms, as well as recognition of traditional authorities, which is timely. It further aligns well with lived realities in rural Africa, where policy often fails to reach the landscape level unless anchored in local leadership. And the third point, which I know that as key strength of the issue brief, there is something that I mentioned about the case studies like the Meet Naturally Africa and the COLANDIS. COLANDIS stands for Collaborating to Operationalize Landscape Approaches for Nature, Development, and Sustainability, which from assessment, it shows how restoration, climate resilience, and economic inclusion can be achieved together. The issue brief further brings up practical climate resilience and economic inclusion, showing exactly how it can be achieved together. So I further looked at it, and there is a practical framing whereby it brings out clearly covering soil health, territorial markets, agroforestry. There is the participatory research, which is deeply aligned with what many grassroots actors are already innovating on. So after looking at the key strengths and the contribution of the said issue brief, I also looked at how relevant is this issue brief to the philanthropies, whereby we look at it from the aspect of it, the philanthropies as a bridge between practice and policy, whereby this issue brief, as presented by Dr. Stephen, makes a clear appeal, whereby say philanthropies can fill the critical gap between localized initiatives and long-term systematic transformation, whereby it also further goes to say that this one can happen by supporting mid-level, place-based territorial approaches, and the funders can unlock durable shift in food systems, biodiversity protection, and climate adaptation. So that is part of the thing that I note as the relevance of the issue brief to the philanthropies. There is aspect of targeted investment areas, whereby from assessment, the issue brief offers actionable entry point for funders. And this is also another area where the philanthropies comes in. There is the aspect of catalytic funding for agroecological design and embedded food systems. There is also the support for inclusive governance structure that is center women and youth. There is the aspect of long-term investment in capacity building, peer learning, and the participatory action research, which also came out from the presentation strongly. There is also advocacy and the policy design that anchors national strategies at the landscape level. So I further looked at the beyond logic, project logic, and I noted that it's importantly the brief challenges the short-term fragmentary funding, where it argues for programmatic support rooted in the process, co-learning, political empowerment, particularly of smallholder indigenous communities and under-resourced local authorities. So as a closing point under that area, we need to look at this one not just as a technical proposal, but it is also a political one, whereby we argue that agroecological territories offers a chance to rebuild the connection between people, land, and food. And I give this one also to say that if philanthropies are also serious about food sovereignty, resilience, and justice in Africa, this is the kind of work that I believe can be resourced patiently, flexibly, and boldly to ensure that at least we advance along this aspect of agroecological principles and realizing all of them, the thing of them as outlined. So that is my brief comment on that issue brief. I'll go straight also to comment on the urban food governance at the supranational level scale, which also was offered by Dr. Luke. And my assessment is that this issue brief is timely. And I believe that as urbanization intensifies across Africa, cities, especially secondary and intermediate ones, are becoming central to both food insecurity and the food systems transformation. Yet when you look at Africa, for example, urban food governance remains under-recognized, it's underfunded and undercapacitated. And further looking at this issue brief powerfully exposes these gaps, whereby from the presentation, the gaps that exist in the areas of urban food governance were exposed clearly, offering a practical pathways rooted in agroecological and inclusive governance models, which I believe also came clear in that presentation. And on the key strengths or further contributions of these issue briefs, specifically urban governance at the supranational scale, I note that about 3 points. There is the aspect of realignment of governance and food systems thinking, whereby the issue brief reframes governance not merely as an administrative management, but as a lever of systematic transformation. It further outlined how fragmented mandates and the resources for national governments and informal dynamics must be addressed through deliberate policy innovation, especially food policy councils and the multi-stakeholder platforms. Another key strength of the issue brief that I identified is the evidence-driven and the practice-oriented. That means it's the evidence-driven and the practice-oriented, where there is an aspect whereby there is a mention of Mbale Good Food Council to Food Portal's Food Change Lab, where the brief elevates African-led solutions, showing how seat-level experimentation can deliver results in nutrition, inclusion, and participatory planning, even resource-constrained environments. This basically came out when the Mbale Good Food Council example was given out, and it was very well elaborated in the issue brief. There is also the aspect of intersectional and the decolonial framing as a key strength of the policy brief, the issue brief, whereby when you look at how the author framed the issue brief, the author did not shy away from naming structural issues such as the colonial legacies, informal market power, the aspect of gender exclusion, and intergovernmental power imbalances. So the approach resonates well with the need to democratize food systems while recognizing urban rural interdependency. That means we also need to look at the rural urban interdependence and how they relate with each other without only focusing on the rural aspect of it, especially in funding the food systems. I further looked at how relevant is it, or why the philanthropy should care about this issue brief. I know that philanthropy have a unique opportunity to make catalytic investments at the supranational level, where most systematic failure happens, but also where innovation is mostly dynamic or mostly dynamic. And the issue brief further laid out credible, cost-effective opportunities for action, which I'll mention as well, such as the support for multi-stakeholder platforms and food councils that can align fragmented actors and enable system participation in the whole process of agroecology, and also realize the 13 principles of ecology, as well as outlined in this issue brief. There is the other aspect of investment in small grant facilities to cover overlooked cost of convening, coordination. There is also early experimentation, as it was done by the Mbale Food Council. There is also the backing of the South-South learning labs, including the promising African Lab American collaboration. That is also another thing that the philanthropists can also come in. We also note of the issue of funding centers of excellencies to institutionalize governance, innovation across cities. So those are the three, or the areas that I believe they're very relevant to the philanthropy, which they can also consider as regards to this issue brief. I also looked at the strategic value of this issue brief, whereby what I came to conclude is that there is such investments are high leverage, small in financial size, but significant in systematic impact. They can allow building the software of governance, relationships, norms, coordination that large infrastructure food access program rely on but often neglect. So that is how I structured it under the strategic value of this issue brief. So therefore, I also adjust that if really we're looking at building resilient, just and sustainable food systems in Africa, especially in the contemporary moment, that we need to focus on urban spaces, ensuring that the urban spaces must be part of the transformation, so that we don't only focus on the rural areas, we look at how best also we can transform the urban spaces, considering that a majority of the people, especially in Africa, are living, or a great percentage of the population are also moving to the cities. So this issue brief further shows that with the right governance models, local leadership and patient philanthropy, Africa cities can become engines of food systems innovation, not just sites of crisis. I think that relates with what else I had mentioned before. So those are the comments that I have, but also if my time allows, I can also give some few comments, just generally. There is, when I look at the agroecological territories and integrated landscape approaches, this is just a brief comments, just in point forms on what also the philanthropies, or what I recommend for philanthropies. They need to invest in territorial food system governance structures. They also maybe need to enable long-term territorial transitions. Philanthropies also may need to preach knowledge systems and policy spaces, and also embedded equity and the colonial values in landscape investments. I may not elaborate on them, I just mentioned them. And on the urban food governance at supranational scale, what I noted as recommendations, which I can recommend for philanthropies, is the fund multi-stakeholder platforms and food policy councils. They also need to create small grant facilities for local actions. They also need to invest in capacity building for local governments, further support South-South learning and the peer exchange, and strengthen civil society engagement and accountability. I believe once philanthropy can also come in through such kind of an investments, we will be able to realize what are the main recommendations of this issue brief. Thank you for listening. Those are my brief comments on the 2 issue briefs. Thank you.
Thanks, Makore. It's very detailed and thorough and insightful reflection. I'd like to offer people in the plenary an opportunity to raise their hands to ask questions or make further comments, and to also offer the speakers an opportunity to respond to any questions raised, but also to respond to any of the points that Makore just made. So if anyone in the plenary would like to speak or raise questions, please raise your hands. This is your opportunity. Or you can even just raise your voice if the functionality on the Zoom screen is a bit complex. Okay, I'm not seeing any takers looking to raise questions at this stage. Stephen, Luke, do you have any reflections or final remarks based on what Makore was just commenting on?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Makore, for that reflection. I think you did a really great job at summarizing and kind of raising up some additional, I think, points. I mean, and there was one thing you mentioned there really as cities as sites of kind of innovation and change and what can happen in those urban spaces. And I think from the point of view of this issue brief, just the challenges of getting funding from national government down to subnational level for this kind of innovative work is very difficult. The challenges of getting debt financing and kind of for cities to access alternative forms of capital that are outside of the kind of national budget or kind of state-driven budgets is also very, very difficult for most cities. So there's a real need and opportunity for philanthropic investment into these city innovation processes, because cities really struggle to get this money from other spaces, and they're very limited in that respect. So I think there's a real need for that, and I think an opportunity where we can do a lot with a little. So yeah, I think I just wanted to flag that and thank Makore for your reflections.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Makore. I think that across the 2 issue briefs, also an issue that really is coming up as these multi-actor processes that are facilitated over the long term. This is really something that we could focus in on. How do we actually get this thing going? I wanted to just quickly raise a question also of resources, because we're speaking as if there's just going to be philanthropic funding coming in and this is all that's needed for the thing. African states are in dire trouble in terms of finances. This economic system has not worked for them. Since the end of colonialism, it's just been a debt trap. That's where most countries are in. So when we start to look about how is this thing going to be resourced in the longer term, it can't come from philanthropic funding. It can't come from an expectation that other people in other parts of the world are going to fund our development. We have to start thinking about how do we fund our own development? How do we get this thing moving ourselves? But that's going to be very difficult when a lot of the wealth that's generated in Africa is extracted out of Africa through these false mechanisms, for example, of debt repayments, which is ridiculous because Africa has paid more than its share of global repayments. I mean, from slavery through colonialism to debt repayments now, it just isn't working. So there's real questions about, can this work really be done unless we take on the bigger political economy questions of debt cancellation, reclaiming our control over the resources of Africa for Africa, because outside of that context, we're not going to resolve these questions. Thanks.
Luke, your hand is up. Please go ahead.
I mean, if I may, I mean, I think also just building on what Stephen has said, I mean, I think there's a need to understand and recognize and map out where we as kind of African states are already spending our food budgets. And largely it's there's a trend away from agriculture into social security and safety nets. So social grants, school nutrition programs, and increasingly agriculture makes up a shrinking percentage of that budget. So I think there's a kind of question about how we first understand those, and secondly try and kind of stack multiple benefits out of those. So when it comes to social grant expenditure, for example, and we know that most of that in cities gets spent on food, how are we making sure that that money stays in local, small, often informal enterprises rather than just disappearing into large kind of internationally owned supermarkets? When it comes to, school feeding programs, philanthropy can play a role in catalyzing and getting them going at a country level, but globally, about something like 95% of all school feeding program budgets are actually nationally funded. But the question then becomes, are you including a component of local procurement in those school nutrition budgets? Are you including kind of conditions around how food is produced in that, and how do you look at kind of regenerative school meal programs, for example? So I think there's this question around how, as the global funding landscape changes, we get better with using what we are already spending, and making it go further, and kind of spending it better and keeping it where it needs to be.
Right. Thanks, Luke, and thanks, Stephen, for those really incisive comments and reflections. I think these are questions that are continuing to kind of shape our thinking around these issues, particularly around how these things can be resourced in the long run. I think what also stood out for me was the need for philanthropies to think about real long-term support for processes rather than projects, and processes that often have unforeseeable endpoints where we don't really know where it's going to head. And also thinking about our current policy process here in South Africa, the need to resource civil society networks to actually be able to meet, to be able to coordinate, to be able to have a clear and coherent voice, and to consistently influence policy processes, particularly at critical junctures where there are policy windows that are opening and providing opportunities for new ideas to really crystallize in actual policy and implementation. So those for me are also some of the outstanding points that have been raised and that are being made in these issue briefs, and I'm hoping that they'll be read widely. And I encourage the participants on the call and those that watch this at a later stage in a recording to please also make use of these issue briefs as a resource to refer to when you devise your own proposals, either to government or to funders, or in terms of designing your programs within your civil society organizations. Okay, so I think we're now going to move on to the second round, which is going to be dealing with two linked topics that also have really important territorial dynamics. The first is around land tenure regimes, land reform, and the role that those can play in agroecological transitions. And that is going to be talked to by George Mark Onyango. And the second theme is on the water, energy, food nexus and how that can support agroecological transitions. And again, that is a theme that cannot be thought of separate from a specific territorial context and all the different social, political, and economic forces that are at play in a particular space. So, George, please go ahead and let us know what your issue brief was about, what your key insights were, and what your recommendations would be for philanthropies.
Thank you, Flo. Thank you, everybody, for being here to share this issue brief with you. We had a team that was looking at land tenure, land reform, and agroecological transitions. This is quite a broad thematic area, and we're trying to make sense out of it from different countries and different contexts. Of course, we all know that land is a crucial resource for agriculture and food systems in Africa. That is very important. And we're looking at it in terms of issues of habitat loss, biodiversity, and so on. So there are all those dynamics and parameters that you'd have to address when you're looking at issue of land. Land tenure, regimes, land reform, and agroecological transitions, of course, are closely tied with the food systems. And we were looking at the food systems within the framework of the FAO's 13 principles of agroecology, with a specific focus on the principle of land and resource governance. But we find that in most cases, we have inadequate or inappropriate land tenure systems, which tends to limit access to land, of course, leads to conflicts. It discourages agricultural investments and prevents the sector from reaching its full potential. And these are all dynamics that play themselves out in different contexts, in different environments with long term effects, especially in most urban areas in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, sub-Saharan Africa is highly diverse, both in terms of the characteristics and the commonalities. And so we are looking at how we shape the policies on land tenure, and the future of agriculture within the context of these different characteristics and commonalities within the different countries. So we say, okay, how do we address the issues of secure land tenure? Because secure land tenure is critical for promoting agroecological transitions. It encourages farmers to use sustainable practices and enhances biodiversity and climate resilience. And that has been a key issue in quite a number of sub-Saharan African countries, because secure land tenure is something that has been locked in the history of most of these countries. And there's what we call the effects of the colonial land dispossession and land tenure regimes that created structures and disconnects within African countries, which have had impacts to date. They determine how we use land, where we use land, who has access to land, who has control of land, and so on, especially in very productive areas where we have demand for food production and so on. Now, for us to be able to achieve this, we addressed our data from different stakeholders within these countries. We looked at government agencies and authorities, because they determine policies, they determine regulations on how land is governed, how land is managed, who has access to land in terms of giving security of tenure. We looked at regional and international organizations who play a critical role, especially in terms of the outputs from the land. We had interactions with research institutions, universities, in terms of the knowledge that they've generated, they've created in terms of land tenure regimes and land use. We looked at local and international funding bodies and how they've been able to influence the use of land. There are information that you get from media outlets in terms of promoting access to land and use of land. There are private sector players, especially in agribusinesses. But then, most important, we have local communities and traditional authorities that impact on land use in different contexts. Of course, civil societies and non-governmental organizations also come into play. So these different stakeholders were very key in terms of informing the assessment of this land tenure, land reforms, and agroecological transitions. Of course, why does it matter? We note that urbanization, which is a very key aspect in sub-Saharan Africa, is expanding the export markets. It's expanding the demand for output from land, and is also expanding the demand for land away from agricultural production as urban areas grow and roll into rural production areas. Then there's also demand for biofuels that is also intensifying pressure on land resources. And you have these large-scale land acquisitions for monoculture farming, which has implications in terms of indigenous production systems. Then we have the issue of reform and modernization of African customary land tenure systems that tend to fall short of expectations, underscoring the need for practical solutions to enhance land security. And we have different forms of African customary land tenure across the African continent that we are able to interact with. And so when we say across the African continent, what does this mean? We were not able to study each and every country, but we had some representation from Kenya, from Uganda, from Malawi, from Benin, from South Africa, from Botswana, from Lesotho, and from Eswatini to enable us appreciate the regional differences that you have in terms of land tenure, systems, reforms, and agroecological transitions. So interacting and interrogating these systems within these countries enabled us bring out some of these differences and also commonalities. And then we look at these systems in terms of the National Agroecological Coalition. How has it enabled for having a momentum in sensitizing stakeholders on food system transitions at various scales, whether the scales are national, regional, or local scales. We look at how these cross-cutting issues like gender, age, and power governance interact with these land reform and agroecological systems within these particular countries. And this is all very well, but why does it concern the philanthropies? When you have strong partnership among governments and non-governmental organizations and academic institutions and local communities and so on, we find that philanthropy support plays a critical role in enhancing knowledge sharing and collaboration on land governance issues. So we have these partnerships. They're essential for creating a robust network so that we can have collective action and amplify local voices and promote sustainable development across the continent. That is very key because having that particular platform in which all these players will be able to leverage their potential is critical in terms of providing an opportunity for improving land tenure, land reforms, and agroecological systems in Africa. So we decided to focus on a few key recommendations that would promote transitions to agroecological farming. And this would also promote donor funding principles and mechanisms that focus on a few key areas. There's the issue of having a long-term commitment. Most support tends to be short-term, 1, 2, 3 years, without having long-term commitment, especially in an issue like land, which requires long-term commitment. We also thought that it's important to have locally led approaches because then that provides a sense of ownership and ensures sustainability at the local level. When we say local, we mean at the national level and so on. And the issue of secure land tenure as well as social equity is also critical because that enhances input by farmers when they have a sense of ownership, when they have that secure tenure. And of course, there's the issue of capacity building and knowledge transfer from different levels that is critical in terms of sharing our experiences across the continent because different countries have been able to solve some of these issues differently, and that capacity building and knowledge transfer would then help. Funding approaches also need to be integrated instead of having one philanthropist funding virtually everything or a particular component. But when you have integrated funding approaches, then you're able to fund a whole picture instead of individual interventions that don't really have a comprehensive impact on the whole area that you want to address. Then there's participatory governance. That is very important, especially when you look at issues of land management, because different countries or different regions have different ways in which land is governed, and bringing in participatory governance would enhance the potential for development of this particular land in terms of agroecology. That, I think, captures basically the essence of what this policy brief is all about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Malik, would you like to offer a few reflections on that so far before we lead on to the next?
Thanks, Georges. Very briefly, thank you for that, George. Issue of land governance is huge and often gets siloed as an individual topic outside of its connection to broader food systems transformation change, especially when you look beyond just the rural landscape, understanding how it's a broader market-related changes for the continent. So that was particularly helpful issue brief for us. I think with that, we could probably move on to the next speaker, looking at the time. And I think we'll pass on to Nyasha, who is going to talk us through how we can use the water, energy, food nexus to support agroecological transitions. So Nyasha, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Malik. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce our issue brief on leveraging the WEF Nexus, which is the interconnected integration of water, energy, and food to support agroecological transitions. So our issue brief comes from a lot of discussions amongst 8 team members across Africa and really trying to understand how the water, energy, food nexus approach can be leveraged to accelerate agroecological transformation, and really recognizing that water, energy, and food systems must be managed together rather than in isolation. And also now trying to bring in what role the philanthropists can play in the sort of integration between agroecology and the WEF Nexus. Why this particular topic is important when you talk of food systems transformations is that agroecology is increasingly being recognized as a climate resilient approach to food production in Africa. There's quite a wave of different projects and initiatives pushing this agenda, so to speak, and which is quite understandable given the climate crisis we're in, as well as the continuing environmental degradation across the continent that we're seeing. Agroecology obviously also holds a lot of transformative potential in terms of beginning to address deep inequalities that we see that exist in our food system, and also reconnecting I guess, society to nature, especially when we start thinking about restoring soil health or protecting and regenerating biodiversity. Unfortunately, though, what we found in our brief is that agroecology also remains quite locked into this idea that it should be this niche, small-scale project, and you find then these initiatives tend to be quite fragmented and also underfunded. And this really limits the capability that I think agroecology holds in terms of building wider systemic impact. At the same time, when we look at the water, energy, and food nexus, we see that it's gaining quite a lot of traction also across the continent, and some discussion with development funders showed that there's a huge interest in actually investing in these water, energy, food projects, especially when it comes to energy transitions. So we then kind of started looking at the WEF approach as something that could help then scale agroecology initiatives and move them beyond this idea of them being niche, small-scale projects to actually transformative projects. And this is because when you look at the WEF Nexus, there's a lot of investment into promoting these system-level coordination activities, and also, I guess, unlocking multi-sectoral investments at the same time. So we found the WEF Nexus to be quite a promising tool that would align and scale agroecological efforts across sectors. But when you also look at the WEF Nexus, you find that there's quite a bit of critique around it, especially in that the WEF Nexus approach has also been stuck in the space where it's largely a discourse tool. So it's this aspiration for us to manage water, energy, and food in an efficient way, in a coherent way. And it sits in these conceptual and policy discussions, but there's still very little evidence of how does this actually work out in the real world? What does it look like as a practical strategy? And what is the evidence on the ground in terms of employing a WEF Nexus approach? So we find then that agroecology also plays a critical role in operationalizing the WEF Nexus approach because it offers more of a place-based practice where we can start to see some evidence of does this actually work? Does the WEF Nexus actually work? And it also allows for us to build in other aspects of things like local knowledge, local indigenous knowledges, aspects of equity and community agency, which tend to be missing sometimes when we look at the WEF Nexus approach because it can be more technical in its approach. And so we begin to see that it goes two ways where we can use the WEF Nexus approach to leverage or rather accelerate agroecological transitions, but also agroecology being a tool that we can use to actually begin to operationalize this WEF Nexus approach. So some of the key findings we found in trying to think about, okay, so if we want to integrate agroecology within the WEF Nexus approach, what kind of challenges might we face? And one of the most obvious one is moving beyond this institutional silos. I think we talk about it a lot. We understand the issues of working in silos, but it seems like we haven't made as much headway in terms of building cross-sectoral coordination around food systems, for example. And that is one thing that would have to be worked on as we start thinking about accelerating agroecological transitions. The other thing that we surfaced in discussing also with other development funders is that policies and investments generally favor, these big infrastructural, classy, shiny, heavy industrial projects. And there's less interest at times to invest in more of these nature-based smallholder agroecological solution types projects, especially when it starts looking at things like indigenous knowledges or even challenging existing power dynamics. And then the other finding we surfaced from this issue brief was that agroecology is also highly context specific. And that may be difficult to now standardize it and integrate it into a WEF approach, which tends to be broader in its outlook and tends to have a stronger orientation towards regional strategies that don't necessarily at times capture local realities. So those are the key three challenges that we found. And from that, we then came up with 4 strategic recommendations for philanthropy. The first one being, how do we actually support integrated with agroecology projects? And I think given that funders are already looking at WEF and are already looking at energy transitions, one of the things then that they could do is, as they invest in such projects, is to insist that these projects be rooted in agroecological farming as a way to now bring in the two. And then the second thing was to do with actually investing in the capacity to bridge silos. I think there needs to be some funding that goes into the training and the coordination platforms that bring together different ministries, departments, researchers, farmers, CSOs, like it was mentioned, and really starting to try and understand what is it that's I guess, keeping these silos intact and how do we move beyond that? And then another key point that we found quite interesting was funder metrics. How do funders actually measure impact and what is it that they're looking for when they invest in a project? From a food systems transformation perspective, a lot of it is still very geared towards production and yield. So we fund this and how much production or yield do we get? And we really want to challenge that and say that there are other metrics that need to be considered, and other indicators, more social indicators. What are we talking about when we look at maybe things like inequality, water use efficiency, and different aspects that we need to really start thinking about beyond the usual everyday metrics. And then the last key point, recommendation for philanthropists is to start de-risking, a lot of these projects and investments, and allowing for longer term funding. I think this has been spoken of in the last 3 presentations as well, but really allowing for these longer term funding cycles for projects so that they can really begin to see some systemic change. And with that, I will end. I hope I'm still within my time. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you, Nyasha. So thank you very much for that, both Nyasha and George. Really, really strong issue brief presentations, and I think bringing to focus the need for funding to go towards one, the sort of supporting for better coordination in these different approaches, which would otherwise fall into very siloed and project-based support systems. So with that, Flo, I'll hand to you to introduce the last round of reflections before we move to close.
Great, thanks, Malik. So we have 2 additional panelists who are waiting in the wings. Nancy Rapando is from WWF, and I recall in one of the very first conversations around the African Food Systems Transformation Collective, Nancy was very vocal about promoting territorial and landscape-based approaches. So I was delighted that she volunteered to be offering her reflections here in this panel. So that's really welcome. Thanks, Nancy. And then Andrew Adem represents the African Food Sovereignty Alliance, which is a kind of movement of movements, Pan-African movement that is promoting food sovereignty, which is closely linked to agroecology and promotes people's right to co-determine and co-govern food systems towards greater sustainability, towards equity and resilience. So we have these 2 excellent panelists. And again, I'd like to invite the other participants on the call, if you have any questions, after the panelists have offered their reflections, you'll also have an opportunity to ask questions or offer reflections. So for now, I'd like to invite Nancy to please reflect on these issue briefs and offer us your insights.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Florian. I hope I'm audible enough.
We hear you.
Thank you. I think what is coming out from the 2 briefs that we've just listened to is the need for agroecology also to go deeper and to go wider, and there is an opportunity for this. For example, the first one that deals with the land tenure issues. I think land tenure issues can really be quite an obstacle to transitioning our food systems towards a sustainable future and implementing practices like agroecology that might need some time. And just using a very practical example is that just looking at issues of who is producing food, most of them being women, with a bit of limited even decision making on what to put on the farm the next season, already that is a big obstacle to any sustainable practices on the farm. The issues of land tenure play out at the household level, but also at the landscape level. Giving an example of one of the resilient farming systems in Africa, which is pastoralism, and with the increasing individualization of farms, we even see like the movement corridors for livestock, for herders, are disappearing. And when the livestock herders still use their corridors, there's too much conflict across even crop and livestock farmers. And all these really get back to land tenure issues. But I was also happy that issues that came out in terms of some of the land tenure systems are taking away too much land into monocultures. And this becomes a bit of a challenge, especially if we have to meet any of the conservation impacts. But I think what also came out strong is the role of different institutions, especially local communities and national governments that are critical institutions. But I think one of the things probably we could have left out is that land tenure also goes hand in hand with issues of land use planning. And if you look at this, most of the agriculture in food actors are rarely in the spaces where land use planning is happening. And yet that is always the time when we need to be clear about our pollination corridors, the movement corridors of our animals, and also ensuring that we keep the crop corridors, because some of the crops actually follow a certain landscape. When you look at, for example, a crop like shea butter, it has a specific landscape that it has followed through Africa. And because of land fragmentation and everything, we lose those movement corridors of both livestock and animals. I think the other thing I liked in terms of philanthropy support and having formation of robust networks for local action and amplifying local voices. I know most of us are talking about the role of multi-stakeholder platforms, the issues around convening, but I think what has now become important is let's move beyond these platforms and look at who is in these platforms. Whom are we actually convening? If we are actually not getting to use the multi-stakeholder platforms to amplify the local voices, then that becomes a bit difficult when we are talking about the transformation of food systems. There is also a lot of, there's need to really understand the changing land tenure systems based on pressure factors like urbanization, land grabs that are now happening in Africa. And there is also an issue of taking out land even for carbon credits. These are things around land tenure that we actually need to discuss, because when this land is taken away, then we don't have enough land for investment. I think what was also key about the discussion around land tenure was also that the recommendations that came out, funding initiatives around capacity building. But I think we must be specific on that. Capacity building must be about understanding land tenure, understanding what is required to transition into the right land tenure system. The issue of participatory governance, I think, is very critical. And participatory governance tells you understanding the different governance modalities, but how traditional governance mechanisms also act as an enabler or also a disabler, especially when it comes to marginalized communities accessing the land resources. Lessons from successful reforms are very critical, but I think we need to be careful, because there are different regimes, there are different colonial regimes that have impacted these countries, and I think they have actually dictated some of these reforms. And if we have to move from these reforms to a different reform, we need to be cognizant of what indigenous systems are there to support it, but also what government systems are there to support the land tenure reforms. The work on WEF is actually exciting because it takes a lot of thinking of agroecology beyond the farm to actually the landscape. Water is a critical resource. You cannot produce without water, and issues of water efficiency become critical. But I want to talk about some of the work we are doing as WWF in terms of using citizen science to actually measure water quality. And what I realized that a number of quality indicators were agriculture related. For example, there is measurement of the amount of silt based on the color of water in the river, but there is also measurement on the froth in the river that actually shows there's a lot of nitrogen or phosphorus in the river, and actually that is quite connected to agroecology, showing how you are overusing nutrients and the nutrients are actually flowing into the river ecosystem. So this allows us to actually address the indicators from a farm perspective to a landscape perspective. I think as I finalize the discussion around WEF is also the issue around WEF has been more used as a tool. I think that was exciting about this Nexus discussion, and now there is need to move it into like an approach. But I want to remind us that there is also the issue of energy taking away land that is meant for agriculture. We know maybe the windmills, maybe the biofuels, taking away land that is meant for smallholder farmers to actually practice agriculture. But what I like about that discussion is the ability to use WEF to actually attract large-scale investments into agroecology and ensuring that there are more resources that go into this big infrastructural support being redesigned around agroecological principles and also addressing the agroecology transition at the country level. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity, and I think my time is up. Thank you.
Great, wonderful reflections. Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, it's evident that you're speaking from a background of a lot of personal experience in these spaces, and I really enjoyed the reflections you offer. So the last panelist who's going to offer some reflections now is Andrew Adem. Andrew, are you still on the call?
Yes, I'm here.
Wonderful. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Florian, for that. Thank you, Nyasha, for the presentation on the WEF, and I must say that the brief highlights some of the things that we talk about as AFSA always, about our food systems being at in a crisis. And the crisis that we are talking about is not because we don't have ideas, but it's because that the models, the industrial models, fragmented policies, and underfunded alternatives like agroecology. I can say that the WEF Nexus emerges as a framework that would connect agroecology with the broader sustainability and resilience goals, and the proposals that have been given to donors when it comes to shifting these challenges, like defunding the harmful and industrial food models that would focus more on then agroecological models, and then also investing in indigenous knowledge. Of course, we know that in communities there are different ways that smallholder farmers are managing this nexus between water, food, and energy. But my key comment on this is that that this nexus has a potential of being a useful tool for agroecological transition, but only if aligned with the agroecological principles. Otherwise, we risk reinforcing the very system agroecology seeks to transform. Because if you look at some of the things that are being promoted by some actors, you look at things like the monoculture projects that are being done, smart farming and mega dams. These are some of the things that some other actors are promoting under this nexus, and so the way we bring it together and integrate it into the agroecological principles would be key to avoid it to avoid any kind of mix. yeah, that's my comment on that. And then I want to also appreciate George for the presentation on the land tenure and land reform and agroecological transition. Just as Nancy said, colonial legacies are still shaping our land governance. And these legacies are created to, they have created inequalities and complicating access to land. And with the things of gender and all those other things, in some countries, land was given more to the privileged and the underprivileged. Now the underprivileged have to struggle to get land. And AFSA has extensively invested in documenting land cases. And if you go on our website, we have documented cases of land grabs where either large-scale land-based investment or some these colonial acts, like where they designated as parks, you find when some group of indigenous people cannot use the forest simply because we want to preserve it for tourism and things like that. So we have those cases that that we have documented around land grabs around the continent, and I would encourage each one of us to go and check that out, because the land tenure is not only a technical issue; it's a political issue, and it needs actions that are protected by policy, and that communities are well protected against any land insecurities, because we all know that agroecological transitions depend. Agroecological transition will depend on access of land. Land is key. Land is one of the key factors for agroecological transition. That's why our work as promoters of agroecology is defending land rights for vulnerable, for smallholder farmers is key to us. And as mentioned in the brief, as AFSA, we also believe that there's need to support customary land tenure system, the governance system. I know that most, like a large percentage of sub-Saharan Africa, they have customary land tenure systems, and I don't know why. I don't know who is convincing our governments that customary tenure systems don't work, so we need to replace them with other forms. We have cases in many African countries where other forms of land governance are cropping up currently, of course, with mega funding. And then also, currently, if we were to protect tenure security, we also, philanthropists and donors need to invest in legal assistance, because there are many rural smallholder farmers who are being evicted. I know in many African countries we have a lot of large-scale land-based investment going on right now, and this investment is mostly monocrop investment, and smallholder farmers are losing land, and there's a need to defend them, and also if philanthropists could and donors could go away from, could defund some large-scale land-based investments that are evicting communities. We have cases of palm oil in countries like Uganda. Also in West Africa, there are cases of palm oil where communities are being evicted from their land. I think one of the last things that I can say is that at AFSA, we believe that agroecology is a social and a political movement. So we can talk about the farming itself, but we can't leave the movement bit of it. And we think that to be able to protect land rights, to be able to protect access to seed, to water, and all the other things, we need to create a movement. And this movement should be strong, should be funded. So I really think that one of the things we should look at for donors out there to fund agroecological movements from the grassroots to the continental level. Thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And I really appreciate your strong closing remarks about the need to recognize that this is a very political thing and the need to support social and political movements that can drive this kind of transition agenda in a way that really takes into consideration traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, customary land tenure approaches, and so forth. So I think that's a really beautiful, strong closing point. I'd like to offer the speakers an opportunity to respond. If there is anything that the panelists have said that you'd like to respond to, George or Nyasha, please feel free to just raise your voices. And if there's anyone in the plenary who'd like to offer any last questions or comments, also you are welcome to do so now. But I'm going to hand over to the speaker to see if there's anything that needs to be said.
It's not really to respond, but there are two issues that have come out, I think, that we need to reiterate even as we go ahead with the issue brief. The first one was made by Nancy on land use planning. We tend to limit land use planning to urban environments, while land use planning should also be covering the rural environments, especially if you're going to have productive use of land. And that's an area that I think needs to be reinforced. And then Andrew's statement that land tenure is political, I think that's a very important thing. Most of the time we operate as if a land tenure and land tenure regimes are a technical thing, but it's more political than technical. And I think that's something that we need to always foreground before we start any intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, George. And I think what I also enjoyed is that all of the speakers have also indicated the way in which these issues are also linked to the colonial history of Africa and the enduring coloniality of our food system. Nyasha, I see that you're unmuted, so I'm assuming that you'd like to perhaps speak.
Just to say thank you to Nancy and Andrew also for their comments regarding the issue briefs, and also raising, I think one of the things that we found in this issue brief is that there are a lot of synergies between the principles that sit under the WEF Nexus approach as well as the agroecological approach. So from that perspective, it looks like there should be a very easy integration, but I did like that Andrew raised the issue of potentially perpetuating the issues we're trying to run away from by bringing in funders that may have a different perspective in terms of monoculture or other principles that are not aligned with agroecology. So I feel like there is some background work that needs to happen in terms of also convincing philanthropy that this is actually a model that they also want to advance across the continent. And the way I see it is that this collective is doing that. And that hopefully the philanthropies that might be reading these issue briefs are already signed up in terms of agroecology being where we want to go, and now trying to think about different ways in which they can pull in funding that they might already have into this transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Nyasha. Are there any last comments from the participants or questions? Okay, then I'm going to hand over to Malik. Any last comments or reflections on what you've heard from the ACF?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Flo. So yeah, this was an excellent session. Thank you to all the authors and advisory committees committee members who participated in it. I mean, the one thing I will say from the sort of ACF side is that this is exactly what we're wanting to come out of this sort of process, is to bring together these complex conceptual frameworks, figure out how we can apply them to embed issues of justice and equity in our food system, especially in the context of the challenge that we face in climate change, ecological breakdown, and other macroeconomic problems. So this is really helpful for guiding our thinking on that and helping us make it practical by linking us to the institutions who are doing the work that you are recommending philanthropy support. So with that, I've got nothing more to add. I see there's one question in the Q&A box, which is about the use of AI. I don't know if there's anyone who wants to speak to how AI influences your work. If not, I think we'll start wrapping up. Anyone want to offer one comment? No, okay.
Malik, I'll offer a quick comment.
Go ahead.
I think we've got to be very careful about this technology-driven process that, okay, AI is here. How is it that we must use AI in our work? Instead of saying, this is our work, these are the kinds of technologies we need. How can we get those technologies to support what we're doing? Because we're falling into this agenda of tailing big tech, which is taking us in the wrong direction.
Nicely said, Stephen. Thank you for that. Great. Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, I think let's move to closing. So thank you again, everyone, for the time, for attending. Please keep an eye out in your emails for invitations to our last few webinars for these issue briefs and our final synthesis report. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you to everyone who participated today. And see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, colleagues. That was
Bye.
a good session.
Thanks all.